In my last video, I assembled the table base using 5/8 hot rivets and gave it an oil blackened finish using heat and WD-40. Since this bridge was built in New Braunfels in the late 1800s, I thought it only fitting to find font that would have been used in Germany during that time period. It took some digging, but I was able to find Una Fraktur font, which closely resembles the original print. One of the challenges with making this plaque was finding a good material for carving. I wanted something that would hold details while making the sand impressions, but would be durable enough to be reused while I learned the casting process. After a lot of research, I ended up settling on basswood. It would provide me with the durability I needed during the learning process, and it would help sharpen my carving skills. After sanding the piece, I had to ensure that all edges were tapered to prevent catching in the sand casting during the removal process. Once I established the border, I was able to transfer the print. I'm sure some old school lithographers are laughing at me right now, but this sponge and stamp pad actually did the trick. One aspect of making a stencil that I didn't factor was the architecture of certain letters doesn't allow for a complete stencil to be made. This led to a lot of freehand work. After using a razor blade on each letter's perimeter, I was able to begin carving. This is my first time ever carving any sort of plaque or carving in general. Prior to this, I had very little carving experience. I found that most of this was just done by what I thought looked good. If there's any viewers that have a background in carving or some tips, I'm all ears. Once I established the background texture, I used a torch on the wood to burn off any stray fibers and then applied a seal coat. Now that I was done with the mold, I needed to build a flask. In brass casting, the casting box, also called a flask, is a metal or wooden box that holds the mold and keeps it intact during mold making and pouring. There are many different types of casting boxes. This one is pretty simple. It consists of a top and a bottom, also known as a cope and drag. In order to prevent misalignment of the cope and drag, guides and guide pins are installed on each end. I definitely have to thank American Quality and Plumbing out of New Braunfels for donating all of their scrap brass and bronze fittings for my first big project. Prior to going into the foundry, the fittings needed to be cleaned of any foreign materials and dry of all water. I'm using a water-based casting sand. I wanted to mix it to the point where it would clump up and show detail, but not have too much water content. I'm using baby powder to help prevent the sand from sticking to the forms as well as the mold. Using the flour sifter for the first lift of casting sand helps prevent any clumps from getting up against the fine details of the mold. Once the cope and drag are packed with sand, I'm able to insert screws into the back of the mold and gently remove it. I then cut a hole into the cope, also known as a downsprue. This is where the molten brass will be poured through into the mold. Here I am making a pouring cup that will sit over the downsprue and act as a funnel for the flask. From the research I conducted, everybody online was talking about water content in concrete and how hazardous it can be if you spill molten brass on it. So I wanted to spread some sand out in order to conduct this operation. With this being my first casting, I wasn't really sure what to expect, and because I don't like going to the emergency room, I decided to put on all my safety gear. I originally wasn't planning on using a pouring cup, but I ended up being very happy that I did so, considering I was a terrible aim the first couple times I tried this. I ended up making 3 separate castings and walking away with 2 good brass plaques. Once the plaques were cool, I was able to remove all soot and debris, as well as grinding away excess brass from the casting process. I had never experimented with any different patinas as far as brass and bronze go, and I wanted to see what just vinegar and salt would do. I mixed up a solution and applied it to the face and let it sit overnight. The next day when I started working on these pieces, I just wasn't impressed with the green patina that was left on them. I really wanted something more dark that would kind of match the oil blackened finish of the base. I ended up removing that patina and going forward with a different product. One of the challenges that I had with these plaques was actually mounting them to the piece. They were so thin they could not easily be tapped and threaded for using fasteners. What I ended up doing was partially drilling into the back of the plaques and then inserting these brass studs and soldering them into the piece. Once the studs were in place, they could then be cut to length and all the excess solder would be filed off. Now that the soldering process was over, I could then begin the patina. I ended up going with a product called Black Magic. I was not only impressed with how fast the product worked, but also the actual color was much closer to that what I originally imagined. After buffing the letters to make them stand out, I then proceeded to coat the entire table base with a hard wax finish, as well as the plaques. Once the residual product was wiped clean, I then moved on to installing the plaques. The plan for the brass studs that I had soldered in place were to act as a rivet. Due to limited access, I couldn't use a hammer, and I ended up using a piece of 2-inch round stock to peen the end of the brass studs. Thanks for watching and stay tuned for part 4 to see the tabletop.